Hello all, this is episode number 27 of Foreign Object and I'm CJ Werleman. On Sunday, ISIS claimed its first attack on US soil when two gunmen approached an event convened by the defective anti-Muslim subhuman Pamela Geller. On October 2nd of this year, it will have been 10 years since I witnessed a twin suicide attack in Indonesia. It was an event that would set me on the path I find myself today. While the images of severed limbs, human entrails, and the cries of the wounded do not occupy my dreams and conscious thought, I've obsessed over understanding violent extremism almost every day for the past decade. The first question I asked myself was, what could possibly drive an otherwise normal, peaceful human being to strap on a backpack full of ball bearings and C4 explosive for the purpose of detonating himself and innocent civilians into a million pieces? In '08, I wrote a book that attempted to answer that question. I blamed religion. With the benefit of hindsight, however, and a decade of research later, it's obvious to me now I had reached the wrong conclusion. Violent extremism might be the most complex psychodynamic that the human species has ever had to deal with. Along with climate change, income inequality, combating violent extremism might be the most pressing challenge we face today. It's why many of the guests I've had on Foreign Object are experts in this field. On episode 21, I spoke with former jihadi Mubin Sheikh. Episode 18 features Dr. Anne Ali, who heads a counter-violent extremism organisation in Australia, and episode 13 features Moazzam Beg, who is wrongly charged with supporting Al-Qaeda and subsequently tortured at Guantanamo Bay. Today I'm talking with one of America's leading authorities on terrorism. Dr. Max Abrahams is a professor at Northeastern University and is dedicated to understanding and combating violent extremism, and he's here with me right now. Max, welcome to Foreign Object.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mate, good stuff. Great to have you on. Mate, so let's start with the shooting in Garland, Texas. What do we know about the gunman thus far?
Sure. Well, it seems like there were two guys. They didn't get very far. They had a lot of weapons, assault rifles. They didn't even break through the perimeter. A security guard shot them both with a pistol while they were trying to run in. There was there's an increased discussion now about potential links with Islamic State. These two guys seem to have been inspired by the group. They were self-declared sympathizers. They may have had some kind of a communication with some other militants based in Syria. But otherwise, apart from ideology, they seem to have been operating independently of the organization. They did not seem to have any actual organizational support, and they seemed rather incompetent to me. And so for these reasons, I would say that, sure, Islamic State says that these guys were attacking on the group's behalf, but for all practical purposes, these were essentially lone wolf actors. And of course, the venue that they chose wasn't completely arbitrary. Pam Geller was hosting a very provocative event. It was a cartoon drawing contest of the Prophet Muhammad. And in the past, these kinds of images have been incendiary and have provoked violence in other places, from Charlie Hebdo in France to Copenhagen. Peter Bergen from CNN wrote a piece suggesting that an attack on this facility in Garland, Texas, was essentially inevitable. And indeed, one of the reasons why the perpetrators were so operationally unsuccessful is precisely because the planners of the event were aware that there was a high likelihood of a terrorist attack happening there. So they, Pamela Geller and company, spent $10,000 extra to get 40 additional police officers, and so the terrorists were outgunned.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was an exercise in futility. That was quite obvious. It was interesting to note a lot of Muslim groups just ignored the event. They didn't even bother protesting it. They've just, dismissed Pamela Geller and her drones as idiots that deserve to be maligned. But I guess I want to get into what could radicalize these two individuals, because the information that's already coming out about these two guys is that they were normal, peaceful, members of the community. The imams at their local mosques said they never challenged pacifist preachings. They never expressed any radicalized ideas. These are guys that have gone through most or all of their lives without a criminal record or violence. Talk about, I guess what I'm interested in is, how does somebody like them, like an al-Awlaki, who similarly had no history of violent persuasions. In fact, when September 11 happened, he strongly denounced it, said that was anti-Islamic, but later he said he became radicalized by the US war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and suddenly had this new awareness that wanted to commit terrorist attacks against the West. So I guess, what could radicalize this? And to get to that point, I had Mubin Sheikh on here, who was a former jihadi and then became an undercover jihadi for the Canadian Security Services. And he told me that typically Western recruits go through what's called vicarious deprivation. They spend all day online looking at videos of US-Israeli military atrocities, and they tell themselves it's not right, it's not fair, it's your fault. Now, obviously, there's no one-size-fits all, but how prevalent is that kind of dynamic with the terrorists you have studied?
That's interesting. I respect his work. He has a unique view, having actually been inside those kinds of groups himself. If for a while I had a different explanation to your question. When you look at the numbers in terms of the countries in the world that are providing these foreign jihadis, the number of foreign jihadis from each Western country. What you saw was that in Europe, countries like France and in the UK were, accounting for a much larger portion of the fighters than, say, from the United States, which seemed relatively quiet. And the explanation then was perhaps that radicalization and the turn to terrorism was really triggered by levels of assimilation, because in these years, I've lived in both places, actually, both the UK and in France. And in my impression, as well as the impression of a lot of other people, is that it's harder for minorities to feel assimilated into those countries, that they always sort of live on the margins of the society and are poorly integrated, whereas in the United States, there's this idea of the melting pot, and we place a premium on assimilation. And so because Muslims in America were better assimilated, they were less interested in joining up with these radical terrorist groups. But I'm not, and that may be true in a very sort of broad macro sense, that societies that are more assimilated produce fewer terrorists. But I'm becoming less satisfied with that explanation, because over the past year or so, there's been a real spike in the number of terrorist arrests who are, claim to be sympathetic to Islamic State. And I do not think that this attack in Garland, Texas, is a complete anomaly. I expect there to be other attacks, unfortunately, operationally more successful ones in the United States as well. And the reality is that there are more people in the United States who are sympathetic to this ISIS message than there were before. Now, how do I account for the growing interest in Islamic State? I don't actually think that there's one causal pathway. I agree that there's a vicarious dynamic where people go online and they see foreign policy atrocities, and that might mobilize somebody in the West to commit violence, even if they themselves are not directly oppressed. It's no coincidence that when you look at sort of propaganda videos by terrorist groups like Islamic State, they feature very prominently, political episodes, often of governments harming civilians in order to rile up potential recruits. So I don't discount that. I think that that's an important point to make. But I think that it's excessively reductive to try to, have to try to come up with a single silver bullet to
Uh-huh.
account for all cases. It's a multifaceted phenomenon. I actually think that terrorism is a little bit like cancer in that respect. There are many different ways of getting cancer. You could get it from smoking, you could get it from the sun, you could get it from chemicals or just mutations. And it's precisely because there are multiple causal pathways to getting cancer that makes its eradication so difficult. We could have a big anti-smoking campaign, for instance, and that will reduce the incidence of lung cancer, but other kinds of cancers will remain. And the same is really true about the difficulty of preventing terrorism. For example, one causal path might be economic deprivation, but you deal with that, and there's still other things like the political system and all sorts of idiosyncratic reasons why somebody might be attracted to a terrorist group. Perhaps they have a friend in it who's urging them to come along, or perhaps they want to travel and find meaning in their lives, or rape Yazidi women, or maybe they're just very violent and they want an excuse to behead someone. So there really is no reason, and that's what makes stopping terrorism so hard.
Well, yeah, and speaking about stopping terrorism, you wrote a paper titled "Deterring Terrorism: A New Strategy," and in it you said that people generally support terrorists for a single reason: to achieve their political demands. But you're saying, fortunately, a growing body of empirical research finds that terrorism is a losing tactic for perpetrators to induce major concessions from governments. So, how do we deter terrorism?
Huh. Well, I think that a distinction needs to be made between the terrorists themselves and those who support the terrorists. Although, of course, there can be a fine line. In general, I think that when people support terrorists, when they don't actually do the fighting themselves and say they're just providing, a financial contribution, for example, I think that they tend to be motivated by the stated political goals of the terrorists, right?
Hmm.
But the terrorists, by contrast, they're motivated, it seems to me, by a wider variety of incentives, some of which I've just rattled off. It's not just because terrorists express some kind of a political or ideological goal doesn't actually mean that their behavior is motivated by this goal. When terrorists are interviewed and they're asked why they joined the terrorist group that they did, they tend to give a very boring answer. They tend to basically espouse the political slogan of whatever organization they joined up with. But if you were to look at the actual path that the person pursued in order to link up with the group, again, it's often much less political. And so that's why their stated rationale doesn't necessarily provide reliable insight into their motives. And now the question of motives is very important for counterterrorism strategy, because the basic idea of counterterrorism is to reduce, the utility of terrorism, to deprive terrorists of utility from using violence. So if we only understood what they considered to be a success, the logic goes, then we can, remove that utility, and they'll be less inclined to pursue that tactic. Unfortunately, terrorists seem to get utility from all sorts of different outcomes. If a target country, for instance, makes concessions in the direction of the terrorists could say, "Look, we got this country, even a superpower, to back down against us. They're afraid of us. We managed to achieve our stated goals. So that's a victory." But Alternatively, if the target country just digs in its political heels, doesn't choose to negotiate or appease the terrorists, goes on the offensive and tries to crush the terrorist group, the terrorists can likewise say, oh, we got exactly what we wanted. We forced this country into totally overreacting, which helps to radicalize the local population, building up the number of potential recruits for the group. And so, because terrorists can basically get utility from their behavior, regardless of how governments respond, whether they make concessions or go on the offensive, it makes deterring terrorists extraordinarily difficult. It's much easier to deter terrorist supporters because their incentive structure is much simpler. They tend to be motivated by only the stated political goals of the group. And so, therefore, if the international community could persuade supporters of terrorism that the tactic doesn't actually pay politically, I do believe that that would deter not the terrorists, but support for them.
Yeah, I mean, you write in that paper that a lot of these terrorists join these networks and groups out of sheer boredom or just wanting to facilitate travel to new destinations. I mean, so it's very hard to deter individuals who see this as an exciting opportunity, regardless of the political end goals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
Furthermore, many of these terrorists, in the end, they don't get the utility that they thought they would. But essentially, they're gullible, they're brainwashed, they're persuaded by groups like Islamic State. This is a particularly common phenomenon with respect to these, jihadi brides. I think that they feel cloistered sometimes in conservative Muslim societies, and they're persuaded that if they only go get into say Istanbul and sneak across the border into Syria, that they'll be endowed with all sorts of new agency when in fact they're treated terribly upon arrival, and very often regret that decision. So it's not even necessarily that the terrorists get utility, but they think they will.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. That's just on that point where you said that terrorists travel to Syria or Iraq, they join ISIS or Al Nusra or whatever organization that's fighting there, and these Western recruits end up coming back to Europe and the UK disillusioned. That the reality does not align with the propaganda whatsoever.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I was going to say that. Interesting piece that was in the New York Times of Moazzam Beg, who I had on Foreign Object. He said that the British government wants to put mandatory prison sentences for these guys that return, even though they've totally removed themselves from the jihad and want to assimilate back into Western society. But the UK law wants to pass a law which it's an automatic prison sentence. But Moazzam Beg argues these are the guys who should be speaking the loudest. We should be putting them on a platform to discourage these would-be recruits from traveling to these foreign lands to join jihad. So speak to that a little. Do you think that's well, in the broader context, are we doing everything wrong to combat terrorism?
Ah, no, not everything. I
Yeah.
think that it's not a coincidence that the U.S. has been relatively terrorism free. I do think that you're quite right that it's very important to speak to terrorists and to former terrorists in order to gain insight into the group. There's a counterterrorism analyst named Aki Peretz who wrote a piece recently saying that the Shia militia in Iraq are making a mistake by summarily executing all ISIS members, whereas it would be much better to take some into custody in order to learn more about the group beyond the superficial things that we observe from outside of it. So I do agree that getting these terrorists as well as former terrorists in questioning is very important in terms of formulating an intelligent counterterrorism strategy.
Hmm. And as far as determining that strategy, interestingly, in one of your recent papers, you wrote that And you've kind of turned conventional wisdom on its head when it comes to terrorism. The conventional wisdom holds that the goal of the terrorist organisation is to push a democratic government into a more dovish stance, to remove them from lands that they occupy, and that's why terrorists didn't that's why terrorists didn't in Chechnya didn't target the Soviet Union, but they did once the Soviet Union became Russia, because as a democracy you can't. Terrorism is hardly a useful political instrument when it's a non-democratic force which occupies your land. But you're saying that all the evidence, all the available evidence, points to the fact that there's no evidence to suggest that targeting civilians is effective, and conversely, that targeting the military is highly effective. So speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, the conventional wisdom, certainly among political scientists, is what I call the strategic model of terrorism. And the basic idea is that terrorism is rational political behavior, that groups adopt this tactic because it's the most effective one available to them in order for the group to achieve its stated goals. And the logic is very compelling, at least on a theoretical level. The idea is that non-state actors will blow up civilians and issue political demands, and governments, in wishing to end the pain and to safeguard the population, will acquiesce in the face of terrorism and negotiate with the terrorists. But that doesn't, I'm probably the first person to seriously empirically test whether or not it's indeed true that in the face of terrorism, countries become more politically compliant. And what I find is that all else equal, the use of terrorism actually lowers the odds that governments will make concessions. Specifically, that when groups attack civilian targets, governments tend to dig in their political heels. They tend to shift to the political right at home, and they're much more likely to respond militarily to the perpetrators. And so, in that sense, terrorism, which I define as indiscriminate violence against civilian targeting, is actually politically counterproductive behavior. There are other tactical choices available to non-state actors which are more likely to result in government concessions. And this holds true even after accounting for the capability of the perpetrators, the nature of their demands, the strength of government opposition. In particular, non-state actors tend to be much more politically effective when they direct their violence not against civilian targets in the form of terrorism, but against military targets. So, for example, Hezbollah was quite successful at repelling the United States and the French from Lebanon because they attacked, the Marine barracks and other military installations. In Somalia, after Black Hawk Down, that was another attack on the military. The U.S. withdrew. The Red Army was essentially coerced from Afghanistan, again because there was selective violence against military forces. You can see the same thing just by looking at the United States. The United States was essentially coerced from Iraq because our forces there were attrited. In Afghanistan, we ultimately left for the same reason, because it was so costly trying to maintain that occupation. You compare that, though, to when Al-Qaeda struck New York City and took down the Twin Towers. That didn't, repel us from the Middle East. Quite the contrary. It brought us in. It provoked us. It made us less likely to negotiate in any way with the terrorists. And so my main empirical finding over the years is that not all violence is equal. Some kinds of violence are more politically effective than others. In particular, indiscriminate violence against civilian targets, which is my understanding of terrorism, is politically counterproductive. And so for that reason, I say that the strategic model, while intuitive and seemingly compelling, actually rests on a shaky empirical foundation.
Well, on that, interesting. Here's a black and white question for you. If the U.S. was to withdraw all its military bases out of the Middle East, and the U.S. was to force Israel into a two-state solution where Palestinians had equal rights under the law and had their own viable, sustainable state, would terrorism against the West end tomorrow?
No, I do not believe that it would end tomorrow, but I do believe that the amount of terrorism would go down. Again, terrorists tend to be motivated by so many different things. It's impossible to account for all of them. And frankly, they very often switch their rationale for the violence. They might be complaining about one thing, but they'll soon find other, raison d'etres, if you will, to commit the violence. An example of that is Hezbollah. Again, Hezbollah was created, as you know, in order to repel Israel from Lebanon. And then when Israel withdrew in 2000, Hezbollah said, you know what, that's not the extent of our goal. We're actually opposed to the entire, ZE, Zionist entity. Al-Qaeda similarly has very, what Jessica Stern calls protean demands. The nature of their, political grievances shift. And so this gives them a continued, rationale to attract more and more recruits, even when their initial political grievance seems to be resolved.
And where is Al Qaeda today? I mean, what's the threat level? Is it just confined to Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or is Al Qaeda proper still alive and thriving, or has Al Qaeda proper been totally decimated?
Well, Al Qaeda Central seems to have been pretty ground down by drones, as well as taking out Bin Laden and in the raid on his compound. But not all the affiliates, have suffered a similar fate. In fact, while some of the affiliates have had sort of a downward trajectory, like the plight of Al Qaeda in Iraq, other affiliates are on the rise. We're currently looking, for example, at the heyday, perhaps, of both Nusra, Al Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, as well as Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen. Both of those groups, at least if you measure their territorial control, seem to be growing in strength. And so I understand that there's a very large focus on Islamic State, but we certainly shouldn't forget about Al Qaeda. Sometimes people ask this question, which is a bigger threat today from the U.S. vantage? Is it Islamic State or is it Al Qaeda? I actually think that that's the wrong question. It's precisely because both groups exist that the United States is particularly vulnerable to a terrorist attack. The existence of one group basically incentivizes the other group to use violence in order to show, look, I'm around, I too am very capable. If you're a radical who wants to join up with a terrorist group, we're a good option as well. And so these two groups are actually feeding off of each other and competing against each other. And in doing so, it actually elevates the risk.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what do you think the West can do better to counter that threat?
Well, I think that
as far as domestic policy goes.
in terms of domestic policy, I think you're going to disagree with me on this one, CJ. But I know that that undercover sting operations are getting more and more heat in the United States. They're becoming more controversial in the same way that our drone strategy has become more controversial. And the basic fear, of course, is that law enforcement is engaging, in a form of entrapment and spurring some Muslims to engage in behaviors that they otherwise wouldn't do. And yet, and that's true. I mean, that's a very real concern that we need to pay attention to, I think, for both moral and strategic reasons. However, it should be pointed out that typically terrorist attacks have been broken up, prevented by picking up on communications between terrorist members. But in the United States, we don't have, active terrorist groups running around. We're more likely dealing with the lone wolf actor. And we're not going to find out about these people necessarily through their communications because, by their very definition, they're much more isolated. And so the only way that we can really seem to locate them and identify them and ultimately, imprison them is by having these undercover agents. And I think that these sting operations have been really, really successful. Over the past year, there's been a real uptick in the number of sort of self-declared ISIS sympathizers in the United States. And luckily, they haven't gotten very far because of these kinds of sting operations. However, in a liberal democracy, I do understand that the government needs to be careful not to overreach. That's a moral imperative, but it's also a strategic imperative. Because if the Muslim community sees basically law enforcement as opposed to the entire Muslim community, rather than against the very, very, very narrow slice of people who are, potential candidates for terrorism, then I think that the Muslim community will be less inclined to work with law enforcement, will get, less reliable intelligence, and the terrorism threat will go up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is what I worry about with, this FBI entrapment. I mean, we're infiltrating Muslim communities rather than reaching out to Muslim communities. And you made the point, and I quoted you in my piece, which was out today on the Texas shooting, and you tweeted, and I quote, "People like Pam Geller put at risk the support of the American Muslim community, which has been among our biggest counterterrorism assets." So how do you convince the Muslim community that we're on their side at the same time that federal law enforcement is using draconian-like surveillance tactics on them?
Sure. So a lot of my early research focused on what works for non-state actors, for militant groups in particular. And again, what I found is that they're much more effective when they use violence selectively against military targets rather than, indiscriminately against absolutely anybody. And the same is also true about governments. Governments err by, by punishing large groups of non-combatants because that only incentivizes them to turn to violence. And so the Muslim community needs to be convinced that it's not under assault in the United States and that law enforcement is only looking for, the few bad apples or, in a much larger haystack if I'm going to, mesh together all sorts of crazy metaphors. But really, the Muslim community should not be taken for granted in the United States. They are a huge counterterrorism asset. The reason why you have such ineffective, thwarted attacks by Islamic State in the United States is because there are so few ISIS supporters. But, again, we shouldn't take that for granted. I believe that would change if the Muslim community perceives the government as the enemy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to sort of branch out then, and we've been speaking exclusively about Muslims, and we have to always bear in mind that the word terror and terrorism is highly politicized word. The threat of right-wing terrorism in America. The FBI has said that they're more concerned, even today, of the threat of right-wing terrorism as opposed to terrorism coming from Muslim communities in America. Have you done much research on the right-wing terror threat?
Sure. Well, when I look at terrorism, all my studies are large N studies, where N is refers to the number of observations. Like many other political scientists, I rely on data sets which have all known terrorist attacks regardless of the ideological affiliation of the perpetrator. So yes, pretty much all of my studies do incorporate violence from right-wing terrorists. I'm also aware of the reports by both the New America Foundation and the Southern Poverty Law Center, which do a good job of highlighting the indisputable fact that a large portion of terrorist incidents in the United States have come not by, at the hands of by the hands of Muslims, but rather, white right-wing extremists, patriot militia groups, whatever you want to call them. And it's almost surprising that so many Americans equate terrorism with Muslims, given the Oklahoma City bombings. In the that's I believe the second largest terrorist attack in U.S. history. 168 people were killed in the Alfred Murrah building, and pundits at the time, they said, without any evidence to support it, that this, must be Islamist terrorism, that right-wing terrorists, wouldn't do this sort of thing. And then, of course, we found out that it was actually right-wing extremism. And so I think Americans need to be reminded that terrorism is a tactic, and that people from all different political stripes have used it.
Yeah, indeed. And bring it back to Muslim, carried out acts of violence. And I wanted to ask you about what role religion plays in radicalization. And I just want to rattle off a couple of things. Scott Altrin, who I'm sure you're familiar with, is an anthropologist and is an adjunct professor at Oxford University. In his book, Talking with the Enemy, they found that of all the ISIS fighters interviewed and all the Al-Qaeda fighters interviewed, none even had a basic understanding of Islam, and that everything that they knew about ISIS, everything they knew about Islam, came via ISIS propaganda. Likewise, Mark Sagerman, who interviewed dozens of Al-Qaeda fighters, found that it can be argued that a holistic understanding of Islam is what invariably brings them out of jihad mode. Mubin Sheikh told me that people become radicalized by their world experience and their moral grievances, then they turn to scripture to find a verse that justifies their vengeance. And Robert Pate found that religion had almost no bearing on a suicide bomber's motive to attack civilians. And in fact, he found that of 95% of all suicide bombers were motivated by a cocktail of influences, including revenge, politics, altruism, and desire to remove an occupying force. In all of your research, is that consistent with what you found?
Well, so you rattled off a whole bunch of different people and included Robert Pape on the end. Let me just say that I disagree with a lot of what Robert Pape has to say. To an extent, his data has become dated. When he published his pioneering study on suicide terrorists in 2003, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, in our flagship journal, the American Political Science Review, the group that produced the most suicide attacks was the Tamil Tigers. And he really highlighted that point in order to show, look, suicide terrorism is not actually being perpetrated mainly by self-declared Islamist groups. But since then, trends of suicide terrorism have changed. In Iraq alone, that theater has completely drowned out the number of attacks that came out of Sri Lanka, for example. There have been subsequent studies, most notably by Asaf Moghadam, who found that indeed there does appear to be a correlation between Muslim groups, Islamist groups, whatever you want to call them, and their tendency to use suicide tactics. But that's at an organizational level. That doesn't actually mean that the perpetrators themselves are driven by whatever you want to call it, by Islam, for instance. The other scholars and researchers you mentioned, they focus not so much on the organizational level, but on the individual. Scott Atran, Mark Sageman, for example, they've interviewed a lot of terrorists, and they find that religion seems to be a secondary factor. And I agree. I mean, it's no coincidence that one of the risk factors for becoming an ISIS supporter these days, it seems to me, is to be a very, very recent convert. You know, it's not people who have a lot of like a long history of training, but people who are sort of self radicalized online, and so these people they tend to have a superficial understanding of Islam, which is based primarily on the propaganda of the terrorist groups. That's why certain books like Quran for Dummies and Islam for Dummies are so popular among this group.
Mubin Sheikh told me that he was radicalized in Pakistan and in Quetta in Pakistan, and then when he came back from Pakistan, he became very he watched all his YouTube videos of U.S. atrocities and blah blah blah, and then he believed that the enemy was the West. But when he went back to Syria to study Islamic studies, when he got a really deep holistic understanding of the Islamic faith, that is what deterred him. Deconverted him from a jihad back to, a non-jihadi or a normal civilian, and is that dynamic seems to play out, quite regularly.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that if people can be radicalized online, then presumably they could also become de-radicalized online. And I've seen some cases on CNN had a special, for example, of a guy who was in Al Qaeda and then turned against the group because the more research he did online, the more he realized that that the violent rationales propagated by the group were, not legitimate. And so it is possible for people to basically reverse this radicalization process. But it really is quite difficult to do. I don't think, I suspect that that's not the norm, that once somebody does become radicalized, they only become even more radical because their social world gets narrower and narrower, and they surround themselves both in person and online with even more extreme people.
Is there a psychological profile? I mean, how pathological are these individuals who join terrorist networks, and are they rational actors or are they completely irrational?
Well, the research, and just because I cite some research doesn't mean it's necessarily true, but I do know that most scholars in most of their studies have concluded that members of terrorist groups are indeed essentially rational political actors, that they have some kind of goal in mind and that they participate in this group to further that goal, whatever that goal may be, whether it's raping Yazidis or beheading people. But the same isn't true about lone wolf terrorists. Lone wolf terrorists seem to have seem to be much more likely to exhibit pre-existing signs of mental conditions. And one of the reasons why that might be the case is because, although not true for Islamic State, other terrorist groups, they tend to have not a completely open door policy. They tend to try to vet out basically the crazies who would be liabilities for the group. Some of your listeners, for example, they may recall, the 20th hijacker, Musawi. He wasn't welcome within the group because he was seen as a potential liability. But for the lone wolf actor, there's no restriction on who can be one. And so that's why they seem to be disproportionately suffering from mental problems. And it's really based on this research where that I've coined a new term. Rather than calling them lone wolves, I call them loon wolves.
That's a good one. Nice one. You need to make that stick. But it's interesting. That's the first time I've or at least consciously heard someone divide the lone wolf into the actual terrorist group proper, the psychological difference. Because Scott Atran, I guess he spoke about that when he said that every leader of every jihadi group that he'd interviewed told him point blank that anyone seeking to become a martyr in order to obtain virgins in paradise would be rejected outright by the terrorist group.
I mean, he would know better than I would in the sense that he has more experience interviewing terrorists. But just from the statement you made, I find that hard to believe. I think that again, people do participate for all sorts of reasons, and the 72 virgins in paradise, that might not be the norm in terms of what's encouraging people to join, but I wouldn't rule it out either.
No, indeed. Well, as we discussed earlier, there seems to be no one-size-fits-all. I mean, and this is what makes this field, so fascinating. And I know it's enormously fascinating to you because this is you're pretty much your life now. And it is a challenge to combat terrorism. And I just worry that we're going around, things the wrong way around. We're isolating these communities and polarizing these communities, and that just only plays into the hands of groups like ISIS. Mate, it's refreshing to hear someone like yourself who talk intelligently on the subject. Max, you said to me before we started that you were worried that you wouldn't have enough to say in 45 minutes. We're now at the 50-minute mark, so mate, you've done well.
We need to do a second episode soon.
Yeah, for sure, mate. No, I'll definitely got to have you back on here. Mate, I read all your stuff. I think that you're writing some incredible stuff. So where can my listeners then find you?
Well, I waste a lot of my life on Twitter. So my handle is at Max Abrams. And, I use the 140 characters to make all sorts of pithy comments about the terrorism landscape, both the research, literature, as well as breaking news events like the ones that we've been talking about today. In terms of my scholarly work, I would hope to refer listeners to my website, which is maxabrams.com. And there I post all sorts of peer review articles that might be worth reading for a larger picture, a deeper analysis of some of these questions.
Do you have a book in the works?
I do. I have a book in the works with Oxford University Press. And so this is yet another reason for me to come back to your program.
Yeah, for sure, mate. No, definitely. When is the scheduled drop date?
I'm not really sure. It's not for probably like a year or so.
Okay, mate. Well,
but I do have a contract.
Okay, nice one. Yep. That's awesome. And what's do you have a working title?
Yes. The working title is The Terrorism Puzzle. And the reason why I call it the terrorism puzzle is because, again, the conventional wisdom was that terrorism is strategic behavior, and that's why groups do it. Well, if my research is correct, that terrorism is actually politically counterproductive behavior, then that raises, the puzzling question of what's driving them to do what they do. And in the book, I basically propose a theory and test it in all sorts of non-intuitive ways.
Oh, mate, that's great, mate. I look forward to when it's out. I'll definitely, that'll be on my reading list, and we'll definitely get you back on here to chat about it. So, Max, awesome having you on, mate. This has been great.
Thanks so much, CJ. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, for sure, buddy. See you on Twitter. See you, mate.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.